If you're born into real power, no one ever tells you where the money came from. They don't have to. The first time my mother truly lost control wasn't during a police inquiry, a courtroom whisper, or even my father's funeral. It was at a charity gala, beneath crystal chandeliers, while a string quartet played Debussy as if nothing in the world had ever gone wrong. I was holding champagne, balancing it easily, comfortably. My mother stood beside me, immaculate as always, pearls at her throat, posture flawless. I casually mentioned that I was thinking of visiting our ancestral estate. "You will not," she said softly, smiling for the donors nearby. In our world, panic never raises its voice. I laughed it off because in my world power is inherited, not questioned, and wealth is assumed to be clean by default. But the look in her eyes stayed with me. It wasn't fear. It was recognition. I grew up in South Delhi, the kind of address that opens doors before you knock. Private schools where surnames mattered more than grades, universities abroad where competence was assumed, drawing rooms where ministers laughed too loudly and never stayed too long. My father embodied old money. Infrastructure deals, discreet political access, influence that never needed explanation. He never raised his voice because he never had to. When he died peacefully in his sleep, silk sheets perfectly pressed, an air purifier humming beside him, the city mourned correctly. Editorial mentions appeared overnight. Industry tributes poured in. A foundation was announced in his name before the grief even settled. Grief in high society is extremely well organized. 3 weeks later, while lawyers and accountants orbited our lives like trained satellites, I found the folder. It was sealed leather, hidden inside a private compartment of my father's safe, with no letterhead and no logos. Inside were land records. Not farmland. Not a sleepy village plot that could be quietly sold. An estate hundreds of acres in Maharashtra acquired decades ago. Acquired cheaply. Too cheaply. When I asked my mother, she didn't pretend. "That land is complicated," she said without looking at me. "Your father handled it. You won't." I said I only wanted to see it once. She snapped no too quickly, then softened her tone like she'd caught herself making a social mistake. "Some things are better left managed from afar. That should have ended it. But entitlement breeds curiosity, and grief removes fear." I went anyway. The estate was breathtaking. Rolling green land stretched endlessly, private access roads cutting through sugarcane fields, and a colonial mansion half swallowed by banyan roots stood at the center like a preserved relic. It was the kind of property people write coffee table books about. The kind of land that shouldn't exist anymore unless someone made sure it did. The caretaker greeted me at the gate. He had been there for 30 years. He knew my father. He knew my grandfather. He also knew exactly why I was there. "They said you might come one day," he told me as he served tea in bone china older than both of us. When I asked who they were, he smiled politely. "The families." I didn't understand at first. Then the meetings began. They weren't dramatic. People came one at a time, always respectful, often with lawyers present. Their voices were measured, their stories precise. They were well-dressed and educated, not poor so much as diminished. Formerly powerful. Formerly relevant. They spoke of shares and arrangements, of understandings older than me. Stories overlapped just enough to form a pattern. Finally, one woman said what no one else would. "Your grandfather displaced ours." The word landed without drama, and somehow that made it worse. "He didn't steal," she continued. "He reorganized ownership." She spoke of influence, pressure, and events that were quietly encouraged. That word followed me for days. Encouraged. I started digging. Court cases withdrawn without explanation. Development permits approved overnight. Newspaper archives with gaps too clean to be accidental. Compensation had been paid, but not to the owners. It went to intermediaries, facilitators, people whose job was to make things disappear. There was no blood, no fires. Just power doing what power does best, making resistance feel impractical. Families were pressured into selling below value. Others were sidelined entirely. Some were offered permanent arrangements, trust funds, stipends, board seats, all in exchange for silence. My father inherited the system and refined it. He didn't expand the injustice, but he maintained it carefully and generously. He paid for education, sponsored children abroad, and covered medical bills. He convinced himself that made it moral, and in his circles, maybe it did. When I confronted my mother, she didn't cry. She poured herself a drink and asked if I thought I was the first generation to feel guilty. Every empire survives because someone decides to stop asking questions, she said. I asked why she hid it from me. She looked tired, not ashamed. Because guilt is expensive, she replied, and conscience is dangerous. That was when she told me the rest. The estate was never meant to be touched. It was leverage and collateral, a reminder to certain families of how fragile their status was, and to ours of how permanent ours could be. Your father believed stability was kindness, she said. Disruption invites chaos. I realized then she wasn't afraid of scandal. She was afraid of justice. I had choices. I could sell quietly, absorb the money, and let lawyers smooth the edges until no one remembered. Or I could intervene. I chose the unforgivable option. I made it public. Not loud public, strategic public. I dissolved the estate into a publicly audited heritage and agricultural trust. Every claimant was documented. Every transaction was transparent. There was no hush money and no private negotiation. The board included descendants of displaced families with equal voting rights, capped profits and education funds instead of allowances. High society hates transparency more than scandal. The consequences were immediate. Phones stopped ringing. Invitations vanished. A senior partner suggested I take time off. Friends avoided eye contact. A columnist implied I was unstable from grief. My mother didn't speak to me for weeks. Then one night she came to my apartment and sat heavily on the sofa. You've made us ordinary, she said quietly. And I don't know how to live like that. There were lawsuits, threats disguised as concern, sabotage disguised as bureaucracy. Some old families resented losing control. Some displaced ones felt it still wasn't enough. Justice, I learned, rarely feels like relief. Months later, the caretaker handed me an old journal belonging to my grandfather. Inside were calculations not of profit but of cost. Names, dates, and agreements written meticulously. The final entry stopped me cold. If these records are ever found by someone unwilling to preserve legacy over justice, the land must be returned in spirit, if not in title. My grandfather had planned for someone like me. I dissolved the estate completely. No private ownership. No inherited leverage. Only shared stewardship. High society called it madness, a betrayal, emotional instability. But the estate stopped being a weapon. Our name stopped being untouchable. A letter arrived months later from the daughter of the woman who first confronted me. Thank you for not turning us into footnotes, she wrote. High society loves legacy. What they don't tell you is that legacy is just history with better lighting. Once you turn the lights on, you don't get applause. You just get the truth. And the bill.